Imagine a city where everything seemed perfect. Advanced technology for its time, a united people, and a grand project in progress. Babel was more than just a city. It was a declaration of independence from God. The people were determined to write their own history, to build something eternal, something that not even the Creator could erase. But there was a problem. They didn't realize they were about to repeat the oldest mistake in human history. Babel was a vibrant metropolis, full of life and ambition. Every stone of that monumental tower was a symbol of a society that believed. It controlled its own destiny. Their trust wasn't placed in God, but in human intelligence, collective strength, and the idea that nothing was impossible for those who worked together. But can unity without God really take someone higher? Or in the end, does this climb only lead to collapse? And here's the big question. Is Babel just a story from the past, or are we still building new towers today? Look around. The world has never stopped trying to create its own version of paradise without God. Political systems, scientific advancements, philosophies preaching self-sufficiency. All of these are Babel rewritten in modern terms. But will the end of the story be any different this time? Will we finally reach the top without everything falling apart? Now picture yourself walking through the streets of Babel. You hear the sound of builders, the voices of merchants, the excited conversations about a promising future. Everything seems to be under control, but high in the heavens, something has already been decided. God was not consulted in this city's plans, but he is about to act. What happens when the Creator decides to intervene in the plans of men? And most importantly, are we ready for his answer? Looking at this story, an unavoidable question arises. What really brought Babel down? Was it the confusion of languages, or was it the pride in the people's hearts? Maybe Babel had already begun to crumble long before judgment arrived, the very moment they decided they didn't need God anymore. And if that's true, could it be that our modern society is already collapsing without realizing it? Join us on this journey and discover how the story of Babel is not just a tale from the past, but a warning for all time. A warning that, if ignored, will lead us exactly to the same fate they suffered. Because in the end, the question isn't just about Babel. The real question is, what are we building today? Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment even if it's just an amen. It makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe and activate the notifications. Share with those you love and help to communicate this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment and share strengthens this work that we do with all the affection to build your life. Together we can reach even more hearts. Continuing, have you ever stopped to imagine what it was like to live in Babel? Not the quick, summarized version most people know, but the daily life in that monumental city. Picture a bustling metropolis, full of movement, colossal buildings, thriving markets, and an advanced culture for its time. Babel was a symbol of human intelligence and power. The people didn't just want to build buildings, they wanted to build an empire that would challenge divine authority. But was what seemed grand truly great? The streets of Babel were wide, well-planned, and always crowded. Artisans sculpted statues of leaders, merchants boasted about the city's wealth, and engineers supervised constructions that seemed to touch the sky. At the heart of the city stood an ambitious project, an immense tower, a symbol of independence and self-sufficiency. The goal? To create an indestructible legacy, something no one could ever erase from history. But have you ever noticed that when humans try to build something eternal without God, the outcome is never what they expect? Now, think with me. How was it possible that so many people were so committed to this goal? What made Babel so special? That everyone spoke the same language and had the same purpose? The answer is simple. The city offered an illusion of security. There, no one needed to seek divine guidance. The leaders guaranteed stability, the economy flourished, and everyone had a well-defined role. But what seemed like a blessing was actually a trap. They were blinded by their own pride, believing they could shape their destiny without the Creator's intervention. And what about you? Have you ever fallen into that same illusion? It might not seem like it, but how many times have we tried to build something without consulting God? How often do we think that through our own effort we can achieve everything alone? The people of Babel believed they could reach the heavens with their own hands. Now imagine the mindset of Babel's inhabitants. They weren't ignorant, quite the opposite. They were innovators, engineers, visionaries, people who believed in collective power and constant progress. But there was one problem. They saw no need for God. Their pride made them believe they could achieve anything on their own. After all, who needs a deity when you have intelligence, manpower, and a thriving city? Isn't that how many think today? Babel's leaders knew exactly what they were doing. They created a system where everyone shared the same vision: to build an empire where divine authority was irrelevant. There was centralized order, a unified culture, and a common goal. The logic was simple. If we speak the same language and have the same purpose, nothing can stop us. But the problem with pride is that it blinds. The higher they climbed, the more invincible they believed they were. But those who rise without God always fall alone. Now think about it. Have you ever noticed how pride can be subtle? It doesn't always show up as blatant arrogance. Sometimes it's that small voice saying, "I don't need anyone." It's when we trust more in our own abilities than in God. That's exactly what happened in Babel. They didn't openly deny that God existed. They simply decided they could live without him. And the worst kind of rejection isn't outright hatred, it's indifference. And don't be mistaken, Babel had order and progress. They had discipline, goals, and strategies. But a society that grows without God builds its own destruction. They were so focused on the greatness of their city that they didn't see the abyss right in front of them. Everything seemed stable until the first cracks started to appear. And what about you? Have you ever felt that false sense of control, only to watch everything collapse unexpectedly? Now imagine a young bricklayer working on the tower's construction. Day after day, he lays bricks, amazed at the massive project he's helping build. One day, he turns to a friend and asks, "Have you ever stopped to think, what if God doesn't want us to do this?" His friend laughs. "God? When was the last time he said anything? If he were against this, he would have stopped us by now, don't you think?" That conversation fades into the construction noise. But what if that young man was right? The problem with Babel wasn't intelligence, hard work, or ambition. It was the removal of God from the equation. They believed they could do anything alone, but they were about to discover that the Creator was never absent. They thought they were in control. But were they really? In that city, pride was the fuel, and the rejection of God was the foundation. But no structure can stand when its base is cracked. And the cracks were beginning to show. The first signs were still subtle, but something was about to happen. What came next? The pride of Babel's people wasn't just reflected in their towering structures, but also in the way they lived. The further they drifted from God, the more they distorted their values. The city thrived, but at the cost of a culture that glorified vanity, materialism, and self-indulgence. The pursuit of power and pleasure became their new religion. In Babel, anything was acceptable, as long as it served the greater purpose of exalting the city and its leaders. But what happens when sin becomes the driving force behind a society? Babel's streets were lively. markets overflowing with luxurious goods, rare spices, and fine fabrics. But beneath the beauty and wealth, there was exploitation and injustice. The strong dictated the rules, and the weak were crushed without mercy. Pagan religions began to emerge, strange rituals became common, and sacrifices were made to gods who never answered. The name of the true God? It was no longer spoken. It had been forgotten, erased, discarded as something irrelevant. Now picture a wealthy merchant walking through Babel's streets. He looks at the city and smiles, satisfied with everything he has built. His shops flourish, his children will grow up in a land of opportunities, and his family will never lack anything. But in a dark corner, a starving child watches everything, knowing he will never have access to that world of luxury. Inequality grew, but no one cared. After all, the greatness of Babel justified any price. Have you seen this happen in today's world? Babel's nights were illuminated by extravagant feasts. Wine flowed freely, and pleasure was the currency of trade. Morality slowly decayed, replaced by an endless pursuit of new experiences. And the more sin became normalized, the further God seemed. But was he really distant? Or was he just waiting for the right moment to act? The people prided themselves on their freedom, but they didn't realize they were trapped in an invisible web. Imagine an old man sitting at the city gates watching everything. He grew up hearing stories about the God of his ancestors, but now he barely remembers him. He looks at the tower, looks at the people, and sighs. Something inside him tells him this cannot last forever. But who would listen to an old man in such a prosperous city? He remains silent, unaware that he is about to witness the greatest collapse in history. Sin in Babel wasn't just a detail, it was the foundation. When a society makes sin a way of life, judgment isn't a question of if, but when. The city stood tall, but for how long? The real issue wasn't just the tower, it was the heart of the people. And that heart was rotten. Have you seen something similar happening in the world? Babel continued celebrating, but the signs of its downfall were everywhere. Small events, almost imperceptible, began to unfold. But no one paid attention. After all, why fear the impossible? What happened next? Babel wasn't just a place of innovation and ambition, it was also a vibrant cultural center. Artisans, musicians, and scribes created works that glorified the human spirit. The city's architecture was breathtaking, designed to impress and immortalize the legacy of its builders. Everything there reflected a deep desire to be remembered, to leave a mark on history. But there was one detail. All this culture revolved around man. God was not part of the equation. And when a civilization removes the creator from its culture, what does it become? The festivals in Babel were grand. There were celebrations for every season, rituals for prosperity, and feasts to commemorate the tower's construction. These were lavish events where wine never stopped flowing and music echoed until dawn. The motto was simple: enjoy the present, because the future belongs to us. But did it really? When a society plunges into limitless pleasure, something begins to erode. The sense of purpose is replaced by an endless pursuit of entertainment, and satisfaction is never enough. Now, imagine a family sitting around the table on a festive night. The father, a master builder, proudly says, "My children will grow up in a better world, a world we are building with our own hands." Everyone raises their glasses in agreement, but deep down, there is uneasiness. The mother looks at her children and thinks, are we really building something lasting, or are we just blinded by the city's shine? She never says this out loud, but the doubt grows within her. The single language was one of Babel's greatest strengths. It united people, allowed them to work together, and eliminated communication barriers. But at the same time, this unity became a form of control. There was no room for questioning, no space for different thoughts. Who dared to speak about God? Who dared to challenge the system? Babel's culture was a well-oiled machine where everyone followed the same direction. But can a system like this last forever? The tower was the ultimate symbol of this mentality. It wasn't just a construction, it was a statement. We don't need God to reach heaven. We can build our own way. But think about it. When was the last time humanity tried this? In Eden, Adam and Eve fell by trying to be like God. And now, Babel was repeating the same story. Has man ever truly learned? The city kept moving forward, unaware that something was about to change. Small events, almost unnoticeable, signaled that a shift was coming. But no one saw it, because why fear something that seemed impossible? The sun rose over Babel like any other day. The noise of construction, the shouting of merchants, the murmurs of the crowds filled the streets. The tower continued to rise. The city flourished, and its inhabitants were convinced that nothing could stop them. But what they didn't know was that at that very moment something was about to happen, something that would change human history forever. Have you ever felt that strange sensation that everything seems normal, yet something in the air feels different? The first signs were subtle. A builder asked for materials and received something entirely different. A leader gave an order, and suddenly no one seemed to understand. What was once simple became confusing. The usual noise of the city was replaced by arguments, shouting, and growing chaos. What was happening? The people of Babel didn't know, but God had touched the one thing they valued most, their ability to communicate. And in an instant, what had once united them now completely divided them. Imagine the scene. A man climbs to the top of the tower to give instructions to the workers. He speaks, but no one responds. He looks around, frustrated, and repeats the orders louder, but the replies he receives make no sense. A strange language, garbled words. He thinks they're mocking him, but soon realizes the problem isn't just there. The entire city is in chaos. It's as if, from one moment to the next, no one speaks the same language anymore. Now think with me. They were so sure they had everything under control. They planned every detail, calculated every stone, strategized so that nothing could go wrong. But they never considered one detail: God, the very God they had tried to ignore, was now making his presence unmistakable. And ironically, he didn't use lightning or earthquakes. He simply confused their speech. That one small change destroyed everything. Have you ever noticed how sometimes God uses the smallest things to make us see the biggest truths? Confusion quickly turned into despair. People shouted at each other, trying to understand. Friends who had worked together for years now sounded like foreigners. Families began to split apart. Groups formed among those who could still communicate. And just like that, Babel began to empty. The once thriving city, full of life, now watched its own people scatter in all directions, carrying with them new languages, new cultures, but also the mark of an unforgettable mistake. The tower was never finished. Their symbol of greatness became an unfinished monument to human fragility. They wanted to reach heaven, but they never even got close. They wanted their name to be remembered forever, but instead, they were marked not by glory, but by shame. They wanted to become immortal, but all they proved was that man without God is always doomed to fail. How many times have we seen this story repeat? And so Babel fell, not because of war or invasion, but because of the people's own arrogance. The plan that seemed flawless crumbled without a single stone being knocked down. And that makes us think, how? Many towers are we building in our own lives? How often do we believe we can do everything alone? Are we, without realizing it, repeating the story of Babel? Something to reflect on. The story of Babel is not just an ancient tale. It is a mirror reflecting humanity across different eras. What happened there didn't stay in the past. The same thirst for greatness, the same illusion of self-sufficiency, and the same rejection of God continue to repeat throughout history. Babel may have been scattered, but its mindset still lives on. And the question we need to ask is, have we learned anything from it? When we look at the modern world, don't we see the same attempts to build an empire without God? Technology advances, buildings get taller, science achieves incredible feats, and all of this is amazing. But just like in Babel, humanity keeps trying to create its own path to eternity without considering the Creator. And what happens when we forget our true dependence on Him? Now think about it. How many times have we tried to build something by our own strength, only to watch everything fall apart? A company that seemed unshakable suddenly goes bankrupt. A relationship that seemed strong crumbles unexpectedly. Financial security disappears overnight. Babel teaches us that without God as our foundation, any structure is destined to collapse. But do we realize this before it's too late? Imagine a man who has worked his entire life to build his career. He sacrificed time with his family, gave up important moments, and one day he finally reaches the top. But when he looks back, he realizes he has lost everything that truly mattered along the way. The tower was built, but the price was too high. Babel teaches us that not every achievement is worth the cost we pay for it. Have you ever felt something like this? Another key lesson from Babel is that God always has the final say. The people believed they had absolute control, but with a single move, God unraveled their plans. This shows us that no matter how great our accomplishments, if they are built in rebellion against God, in the end, He will always have the last word. And the most fascinating part? He didn't need to destroy the city. He simply touched their communication, and everything fell apart on its own. And here's an intriguing thought. Will we ever realize that our pursuit of independence from God is just an illusion? Humanity continues to build invisible towers, structures of pride, systems that try to eliminate faith. But just like in Babel, a moment always comes when everything collapses. The story doesn't change. The characters do, but the plot remains the same. Until when? Babel fell because they forgot God. But the real question is, what are we building? In our lives, something lasting with solid foundations, or just another tower doomed to fail? The end of Babel wasn't just about dispersion. It was a warning for every generation to come. Are we listening? Babel teaches us one undeniable truth. Unity without God is not strength. It is an illusion. The people of Babel were united, spoke the same language, had the same purpose, and worked like a well-oiled machine. But did that lead them to the right path? No. Their unity wasn't built on truth, but on pride. It wasn't an alliance to glorify God, but to exalt humanity. Does this remind you of anything happening in today's world? Humans have an innate need to belong. We form groups, follow ideals, create communities. But when that unity excludes God, it becomes dangerous. Think of how many empires throughout history tried to create a perfect world order, only to crumble when they least expected it. Rome, Babylon, even Babel itself. Every one of them tried, and every one of them failed. Why? Because they tried without God. Now, imagine a common man in Babel. He wakes up early, heads to work on the tower, and feels proud of what he is building. His friends talk about the city's glorious future, about how they will be remembered forever, but deep down, he feels something strange, an emptiness. Something tells him that no matter how great the tower is, something is wrong. He ignores the thought and keeps working. But should he have stopped to listen? Many believe that as long as people unite around a common goal, they must be right. But history proves the opposite. Unity in error is even more dangerous than division. Babel didn't fall because of a lack of organization. It fell because its foundation was a lie. Today, the world tries to build a perfect society, free of differences, free of limitations, free of God. But isn't this just another modern Babel waiting to be scattered? Babel teaches us that not all unity is good, not all progress is a blessing, and not all towers take us higher. Sometimes, what looks like an ascent is actually a disguised fall. What are we building today? Are we uniting for the right reasons, or just repeating Babel's illusion? Something to think about. The construction of the Tower of Babel wasn't just an architectural project. It was a declaration of independence. The people wanted to prove that they didn't need God, that they could reach heaven on their own. But this desire to become like God wasn't new. In the Garden of Eden, the serpent whispered the same promise, "You will be like God." And humanity fell. Now, in Babel, they were trying again. But can anyone truly take the place of the Creator? The problem was never progress, technology, or intelligence. God never opposed human creativity. The problem was the heart behind the construction. The people of Babel didn't just want to build a city, they wanted to establish a reign where God was unnecessary. And that is the root of all sin, the desire to live without depending on the Creator. But can creation ever truly exist apart from the one who gave it breath? Now imagine one of the architects of the tower. He stands high, on the scaffolding, looking down at the city below. He feels proud of the work, convinced that they are close to reaching heaven. "Just imagine," he says to a colleague, "if we keep going, soon we will have access to the divine. No one will ever have to fear another flood or depend on the will of an invisible being. We will be masters of our own destiny." His friend nods in agreement, but both ignore one truth. The Creator was watching, and he was not impressed. How many times has humanity tried to take God's place? How many empires, ideologies, and movements have tried to create a world where he is no longer needed? Science tries to explain life without a creator. Society establishes moral standards without the word of God. The world seeks meaning in everything, except in what truly matters. But in the end, history always proves the same point. Without God, everything collapses. Think of a great ship sailing without a compass. It may be strong, have the best technology, and seem indestructible, but without a clear direction, it is destined to be lost. Babel was that ship. They were moving forward at full speed, but without guidance. And in the end, their tower never brought them to God. It only accelerated their own downfall. And here is the most interesting part. God didn't destroy Babel with fire from heaven. He didn't send a flood or an earthquake. He simply touched their ability to communicate, and everything unraveled. This teaches us that the greatest judgment of God often doesn't come as a visible catastrophe, but as a simple act that dismantles everything we built in pride. Have we seen this pattern throughout history? Man has always tried to be God, but the truth is, he has never been anything more than dust. And this lesson repeats itself in every generation. The real question is, Babel wasn't the first great human project to fall, and it certainly won't be the last. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that whenever man tries to build an empire without God, sooner or later, that empire collapses. Whether it's a city, a system, a government, or even a personal life. But have we learned this lesson, or are we once again repeating the same mistakes? The world today is full of new Babels. Technology has shortened distances, information is instant, and humanity is more connected than ever. We are rebuilding what was once scattered. But are we doing it the right way? Or are we just constructing another tower that will eventually be torn down? Man still believes he can rule the world without God. But can he? Now imagine a scientist in a laboratory, convinced that he is on the verge of a discovery that will change everything. He looks at his research and thinks, we are getting closer and closer to deciphering the secrets of the universe. Soon, we will understand everything, control everything, dominate everything. But what happens when man believes he can take the place of God? Babel showed us the result. But are we paying attention? History is cyclical. What happened in Babel has already happened many other times. Empires rose and fell. Great civilizations tried to build an eternal legacy and were reduced to ruins. And yet man keeps trying. But the question is not just about civilizations, it's about each of us. How many times do we build our own tower, trying to do things our way without consulting God? And how many times do we watch everything collapse because we ignored the true foundation? Now, think about how we live today. There is a culture that preaches self-sufficiency, personal power, and human ability to shape destiny. But Babel already tried that before, and God did not allow it. Are we heading toward another great dispersion? Or this time, will we finally understand that the only way to build something lasting is by putting Him at the center? The fascinating thing is that despite everything, God never abandoned humanity. He scattered Babel, but He did not destroy the earth. He confused their languages, but He did not stop mankind from moving forward. His judgment was not about extermination, it was about correction. And even today, He does the same. He allows us to go so far, but when we drift too far, He intervenes. Sometimes subtly, other times drastically, but He is never silent. So what does Babel teach us about the future? It teaches us that God will always have the final word, that any project without Him is doomed to failure, that human pride will always be broken. And above all, that the only thing that truly withstands time is not what we build with our hands, but what we build in God. Are we building the right way? Babel was a failure because it tried to create a path to heaven without God. They wanted eternity, but ignored the one who created it. And the irony of this story is that centuries later, God did open a way to heaven, but it wasn't through a tower built by human hands. It was through Christ. Have you noticed that every human attempt to reach God fails, but when God comes down to man, everything changes? The problem with Babel was never progress or hard work. It was pride. They wanted to reach heaven on their own merits, but no human effort can do that. The Bible is clear. There is nothing we can do to earn our place with God. Sin separates us, and no matter how many towers we build, we can never cross that gap alone. Have you ever tried to achieve something on your own, only to realize in the end that it wasn't enough? Now think about the difference between Babel and God's plan. Man tried to build a tower to reach heaven, but God sent His Son to come down to us. At Pentecost, centuries after Babel's dispersion, the Holy Spirit came and restored the communication that had once been confused. The disciples spoke in different languages, but this time, the dispersion turned into unity. Under God, not against Him. Babel scattered, Pentecost restored. Imagine a man who spent his whole life trying to prove his worth, trying to build something that would make him eternal. At the end of his life, he realizes that everything he built will disappear. But then, he discovers something that cannot be lost, a true relationship with God. And he realizes that the true path to heaven was never something he could build, but something God had already prepared. And here is the great lesson. Humanity keeps trying to build modern Babels, but the only real path to eternity was opened on the cross. The Tower of Babel was abandoned, but the cross will never be torn down. Babel brought confusion, Christ brought redemption. Human pride led us away, but God's grace brought us back. And the question remains, which path are we following? The path of Babel or the path of the cross? Babel fell. The tower was left unfinished, the people were scattered, and the city that was meant to be eternal faded into history. What seemed like a triumphant ascent to heaven became a testimony to human fragility. But the story didn't end there. The same pride that destroyed Babel still runs through humanity's veins, and what happened in that city continues to repeat, generation after generation. The only difference is that today, the towers are not made of bricks, but of ideologies, technologies, and systems that try to erase God. But will the outcome be any different this time? The great irony of Babel is that man tried to reach heaven, but it was God who came down to him. The Creator himself looked at what they were doing and decided to act. It wasn't an act of destruction, but of correction. God confused their languages because he knew that path would lead them to ruin. And this is a truth that many refuse to accept. Sometimes God does not allow something to continue because he knows the end will be catastrophic. How many times have we wanted something so badly, only for it to fall apart? Was it just bad luck, or was God protecting us from a disaster we couldn't see? But there's something even deeper in this story. Babel doesn't just teach us about judgment, it teaches us about mercy. The people were scattered but not destroyed. God didn't eliminate them, he just redirected their paths, and centuries later, he would restore what had been broken. At Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came upon the disciples, languages were unified once again. But this time, it wasn't to defy God, it was to glorify him. What Babel divided, God restored. Now, look at your own life. What have you been building? Something lasting with strong foundations, or a tower of pride that could collapse at any moment? Babel teaches us that any project without God is destined to fail, but it also teaches us that he always offers a better way. The problem is, we often refuse to see it. The end of Babel's story wasn't just confusion and dispersion. It was a warning that echoes to this day, reminding us that no tower built on human pride can stand forever. But those who build upon the rock, upon the word of God, will never be shaken. The choice is before us. Which path will we take?